Welcome to the Birth Lounge Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts and learn how to craft your ideal birth. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Birth Lounge Podcast. We're so excited to have you here today. You guys, I'm sitting down with pelvic floor physical therapist and one of my very good friends, Dr. Jen Morgan, who's also the founder of Centrality Wellness. And today we're going to be diving into prolapse after birth. It's rare, but it happens. And I think there is so much fear around prolapse. And really the biggest question that I hear as a doula and someone who works with postpartum people is, how do I know if I have prolapse versus just a weak kind of vaginal muscles after having a baby? So Dr. Jen, welcome to the show, and we're excited to hear all the deets. Give us all the good news.
Oh my gosh, I love this. Hehe, thank you so much for having me. This is always, we have a blast. So I'm like super excited. We always have a blast. And let me tell you, like, prolapse is one of those things that I find gets like glazed over. It's like, oh, you have a prolapse. And then moms are like, wait, what? Like, what are you talking about? And the biggest thing that I see as a clinician is that doctors, midwives, OBGYNs, use the word prolapse differently than like your rehab professionals. So we're really going to dive in today, like, what does prolapse mean, or like, what could it mean? And then we're going to help break down, like, what does that mean for you? What can you do about it if you do have one? And we'll just kind of like break into it and see what we got going on.
Start us off with, what is prolapse? Does it literally mean that something is hanging out of your vagina?
Great question. So when we start talking about prolapse, some of the words that you're going to hear are like a cystocele or a rectocele, right? So when you see a seal at the end of a word, that is related to a prolapse, aka an organ is close to or beyond the opening of the vagina. When we are looking at our organs in our vaginal canal, here's your vagina, here's your uterus, here's your rectum. If your rectum is moving forward into your vaginal canal, or you can see it laying on your back through the opening, that is what a rectocele is. And a cystocele is your bladder. First and foremost, we want to figure out, like, what is prolapsing? Like, what organ are we talking about? Where are we in relation to the opening of the vagina? Because that is always going to be our point of focus.
Painful or not painful? Are we looking at like, ouch, this hurts? Or are we just looking at like, oh, this feels weird and my vagina feels full?
Yeah, most of the time we're talking weird, right? Most of the time we're talking pressure, we're talking weird, we're talking heaviness, but it's not just about the muscles themselves, right? So when we think about an organ, right? So let's think about the uterus, right? So we're thinking about the uterus here. Your uterus is supported by, the bottom part of that vaginal canal, supported by your pelvic floor muscles. It's also supported by the fascia or the connective tissue that hold it and support it up, right? Lifting it up inside that top of the pelvis in the lower abdominal cavity. And it's also crazy influenced by our hormonal state and like what we have going on in our life, as well as how strong are we externally? How strong are our glutes? Are we someone who has chronic constipation and we're holding and straining and bearing down historically? So there are a lot of things that we want to look at when we're talking about rehabbing a prolapse. But if we're talking like a grade 1 or a grade 2, there are some people who don't even realize that they have, the bladder resting a little bit lower or the rectum resting a little bit lower, because your nervous system also plays a role in how imperative or how scary, quote unquote, for your body is it, and how sensitive are you to it where it's resting. So lots of things go into it, but a 0 or 1, typically nobody even realizes it.
What are you noticing that should kind of tip you off to say like, oh, I might need to get to a pelvic floor specialist to get this checked out?
As a rehab professional, I always want to talk about how much mobility do you have when you are doing exercise, right? So if you are leaking on a cough or a sneeze, or if you're feeling pressure or almost feel like your pelvic floor is bottoming out when you're trying to poop or lift or, carry your kid, those are signs that you should go seek out a pelvic floor therapist, and potentially prolapse will be your driver. There are times where I have people come to me for other reasons: pain with sex, incontinence, constipation, difficulty emptying. And it turns out that their driver is the position of their organ, or how their organ moves during function, and it's actually creating dysfunction. Now, there are sometimes people are like, I feel like I have a tampon stuck in my vagina, or I feel like there's a golf ball, or I feel like there's a ping pong ball, or there's something like a dry something. That to me screams there's probably an organ that is resting or collapsing within the vaginal canal. So you have to start teetering out, like, is it your primary driver? Like, is it you're feeling those stuck feelings? Or is it more of a secondary thing where you're having a little bit of other dysfunction that maybe your organ position can play a role in?
Just to prepare you, are we looking at an internal exam being absolutely needed for a prolapse check?
Ooh, gosh, I really fall into the nothing is absolutely necessary ever category, right? Because here's the thing, we can navigate around it. Now, most of the time people come to me and they understand that, when I lay out all the pieces of what the assessment could be, I really follow the a la carte model, right? We're going to look at some things on the outside. We might look at some things on the inside. We might look at how you're breathing and you're moving in your squats, for example. But an internal pelvic floor muscle assessment in supine on your back, as well as in standing, because it also plays a role how gravity, which is not our friend, both of those things are really, they give me a lot of insight, right? They give me a lot of information about how you function and how your pelvic floor functions, because pelvic floor strengthening is one of like the cornerstones of any sort of prolapse if it's secondary to weakness. So if someone's open to an internal assessment, we will, but again, it's very staged. And at any point in time, the ball is always in their court where they can say, I'm not feeling this. Cool, we stop. And then we just change courses.
Can you talk us through what that rehab would look like? Also, how long on average it might take to rehab that?
Sure. So if we're talking very early postpartum, there's going to be for most people a sensation of like heaviness, especially if their birth story has a lot of sustained closed glottis pushing, or potentially if there was some perineal trauma or some just strain or difficulty. A lot of those times our muscles get really fatigued, and so we can have pelvic floor dysfunction and we can have some pelvic floor heaviness. Like if that doesn't clear in a couple of weeks, or it's not even getting marginally better as the days go on, that is when you want to start seeking out care. The rehab process itself, it varies, right? If there is a muscle weakness component, we are looking at, somewhere between, strength changes take about 12-ish weeks to like notice improvement, right? So we're looking at 12-ish weeks, and that is for a pretty straightforward weakness case, right?
So if someone has a 3rd or 4th degree tear, which I just went into this in depth in the Birth Lounge. If you guys don't know about the Birth Lounge, it's our monthly membership for expecting and new parents to help you prepare for a confident and informed birth. But we just went into all of the different grades of tearing. I didn't talk about prolapse because I didn't know about it. But if you have a 3rd or 4th degree tear, are you looking at an increased risk of also having prolapse possibly?
Potentially, right? So if we're talking 4th degree tear, right? You're talking that you actually tore into that external anal sphincter and into that rectal, space. I have seen like correlation clinically from how my patients have presented.
Definitely. So listeners, honestly, if you don't know the difference between open and closed glottis pushing, this is just the time to check it out. If you don't know about our secret sauce to pushing, definitely check that out. You can go to thebirthlounge.com/secret sauce to pushing. And we teach you how to push actually with your body upright, not on your back. It is just so, so important. Purple pushing does increase your risk for so many things, both during labor, but also after birth. Anything else that we may need to know about prolapse? Anything at all?
Prolapse can be scary, right? And so if you have or receive a diagnosis from your physician or someone else that you have a prolapse, it's not life-ending or life-altering, right? You still will be able to maneuver around that. You should be able to lift and bend and pick your kids up and play and do everything that you want to be doing. It's just sometimes we have to navigate around that to figure out how do we do those things and how do we make sure that you are symptom-free or able to manage your symptoms. If you feel like you have a prolapse or you feel like something else is going on, seek out the care of a pelvic health specialist. And a pelvic health specialist can be either a physical therapist or an occupational therapist who are trained in rehab for the pelvic floor. Truthfully, every single person who's ever given birth should be seeing a pelvic floor specialist, without a doubt. It should just be an automatic referral. Unfortunately, our country is not as equipped as some other countries to give that referral pathway, but they are probably in your backyard. And if they're not in your backyard, there are virtual resources. So I strongly, strongly recommend even just talking to someone about prolapse, either the diagnosis or the mobility of an organ creating a prolapse. You should have that conversation if needed.
You talked about incontinence. Can you touch quickly on urinary and fecal incontinence? Mainly that A, it is very common, and B, it is fixable, because that is so scary to have a baby and then afterwards you keep peeing or pooping on yourself. That doesn't only like impact you kind of physically, but also mentally too as an adult. That can just really rock your world.
Absolutely. Incontinence, especially urinary incontinence, it's very well studied that it is a drastic quality of life measure. Like, and people are completely impacted by having incontinence. They're self-conscious. They're worried if they're peeing all the time. They're always focused on where their next bathroom is going to be available. So we want to figure out like what type of incontinence we are having. And then we want to figure out why is it happening? Because even though some people say, oh, I have to wear black leggings to the gym because I'm leaking, it's just my rite of passage of being a parent. It doesn't have to be that way. And rehab, because your pelvic floor are skeletal muscles, just like your bicep, right? Your bicep contracts, relax, can get strong, can get weak. Your pelvic floor is the same. And after birth, those muscles just, think about running the New York Marathon, right? Or the Boston Marathon. They just did this marathon. We cannot expect that your pelvic floor is just going to like naturally just go back to whatever it should be doing or used to be doing. We should be rehabbing that.
If people wanted to get in touch with you or they were experiencing some of the challenges that we touched on today, how should they get in touch with you?
One, find me on Instagram. So my handle is at doc_Jen Morgan, JENMORGAN. They can also email me, which the email here is hello, HELLO, at centralitywellness.com. Or they can find me on my website, which is just centralitywellness.com.
Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Birth Knowledge Podcast. Until then, head over to Instagram and find us at Tranquility by Hehe and give us a follow. You can also check us out at thebirthlounge.com.